This is the last lecture on Neo-Confucian thought, starting from next Tuesday. For the final 4 lectures, we'll be dealing with the modern transformation of Confucian humanism and the critique of the Confucian mode of thinking from liberal democratic traditions of the West. In the last few weeks, it's been a very good learning experience for me. I visited some of your sections and bombarded with questions, and I felt that I was going through a kind of PhD exam. All the questions were prepared. I was the only one not necessarily prepared for those occasions, but it was very, very educational. And also, I visited Brooklyn High twice, talk about Confucian ethics. And even Lynch Larding School, and they have courses on comparative ethics. So it's been very stimulating. The topic today is the anthropocosmic vision. Even though I prepared the outline before, I think I changed my mind somehow. So I'm not going to follow the outline specifically in any kind of detail, but the outline can still help as a guide for some of the broader pictures. Maybe a summary statement of the Confucian approach to moral reasoning from my own perspective. One intriguing phenomena, if you look at it comparatively, one intriguing phenomena that in the Confucian style of moral reasoning is this attempt first to ground the moral project in the most generalizable, in the sense universalizable, most generalizable, universalizable context. It's unusual in many courses of moral reasoning to spend that much time on cosmological issues, the question of heaven, the question of nature, the question of what is really out there, the question of investigation of things. Of course, in many religious ethics, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, you have a great deal of discussion on worldviews, but most of the other courses in the moral reasoning based upon the perceptions developed in the modern West, you do not spend that much time on issues that are not directly relevant to the moral project itself. So that's one distinctive feature, is try to ground the moral project in the most generalizable, universalizable fashion. And in fact, you can even say the whole idea about being moral is not clearly differentiated from being natural, being just in tune with the world. And that's the reason that the Confucians, especially the Neo-Confucians, would be able to tap their moral resources, not just from the rules of the game, how you ought to do in terms of a specific social context, but from natural feelings, from aesthetics, from the body, on the one hand, and also from religious resources on the other. So the style of moral reasoning is very much informed by human feelings, aesthetic sensitivity, as well as ultimate concern in the religious arena. And yet, paradoxically, the second part is that moral reasoning have to begin with yourself, here and now, rather than set up general rules. You have to put it into practice. You have to reflect upon things at hand. You have to take your ordinary life seriously. You have to do it. You have to respond to the immediate environment. And continuously, all these thinkers say, don't think in the abstract sense. Try to embody something. try to read a few accounts, not too extensively, and try to digest it as much as you can. You have the grandiose vision of the universe on the one hand, then you have this idea that you have to begin here and now. And of course, Confucian ethics as a form of, I call it embodied, idea of embodied humanity, is really the interplay between these two things, these two orientations. A very broad, comprehensive vision of the world on the one hand, and very concrete, realistic sense of what you can do in your daily existence here and now. It is true that Confucianism is considered as a worldview, as a form of social ethics, as a political ideology, of course, as a scholarly tradition, also as a way of life. In some of the sections we discussed whether it is a religion or not. My own position is that it is not a religion in the sense Christianity is a religion, Islam is a religion, Buddhism is a religion, because it's not an organized religion. You do not have a founder in the Confucian tradition that's comparable to Jesus or to Shakyamuni or to Moses and the great prophet, Muhammad. So Confucius was not a founder of a religion, nor did he manage to live up to the highest ideal of a Confucian, because the highest ideal of a Confucian is the sage king. And Confucius was perhaps a sage. He didn't think that he was, but many of the students believed that he really reached sagehood. But he never claimed that he was sagely, and certainly he failed politically. So he was never a king. It's difficult for us to imagine, for example, in the Christian tradition, anyone who can be more Christian than Jesus Christ. Difficult for us to imagine in the Buddhist tradition, anyone can be more Buddhistic than Shakyamuni. But in the Confucian tradition, it's possible for us to imagine many people become more Confucian than Confucius ever became. And we can say we can potentially be more Confucian than Confucius. Theoretically, there's no conflict. And there's no priesthood. The Confucians never developed the system of priesthood or the monastic order. And there's no scripture in the Confucian tradition that is comparable to the Bible or to the Quran or even to some of the great Buddhist sutra. All these texts that we've encountered, classical texts, some of them could be considered even scriptural. They're all negotiable. We can disagree with them. We can argue against them. We can say they made mistakes. And it's not only reasonable, it's accepted in the Confucian tradition. You can quarrel with the text. You can, in fact, quarrel with all the authors of the text. You can enter into a negotiation, debate, and argument, of course, provided that you are informed and you're not simply imposing your own bias or prejudices. So it's all open. And I'm quite emphatic in arguing that in the Confucian tradition, there's nothing, no statement, no precept, no idea that is not subjected to further evaluation, further discussion, further verification. So in this sense, you can even say there's no dogma in the classical religious sense. And of course, there are many, many constraints, many, many ideas that are compelling, but there's no dogma you can argue against it. And you can say that it's all the institutions, including the family, society, and government, and so forth, none of these institutions in the Confucian tradition has not yet been subjected to critical reflection. I will get a chance to talk about it a little bit later. One of the most important institutions in Confucian thinking, of course, is the family. And the family has been critiqued by some of the most brilliant Confucian minds in modern China. And I use one example. Some scholar even said family is the source of all evils. very strange, un-Confucian statement, but uttered by the major Confucian. And of course, you can argue against his position, but what he was talking about, he was referring to the three bonds, the authority of the father over the children, authority of the ruler over the minister, authority of the husband over the wife. He said that's totally not modern, totally incompatible with the modern sense of human flourishing. So the family, as many of the Confucians believed, was sacred, turned out to be the source of all evils. Now, all this seems to suggest that the Confucian tradition not being a religion, we cannot use religious categories or ideas, try to understand them. There's no idea of the monotheistic God. There's no idea of the ultimate salvation or the afterlife and things of that nature. And yet, even though I admit that the Confucian tradition is not a religion, I think it's profoundly religious. And my position is not widely accepted, as you know. I think it's profoundly religious in the sense learning to be a Confucian is not simply learning to be a good person. There's ultimate transformation in this process. And the ultimate transformation is predicated on the importance of heaven, the continuous presence of heaven in our ordinary daily life. In fact, you can even consider there's a commitment to or dedication to the ultimate transformation in the form of a kind of calling. The Christian idea, what is your calling? That calling for the Confucians turned out to be as comparable in intensity of feeling and seriousness of purpose to any of the great religious traditions in the world. So they take seriously about learning to become a sage or learning to be human in such a way the kind of emotional intensity is comparable to any major religious tradition. So I think it makes sense for the Confucian tradition to be grouped together with the major religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or Jainism, and discussed as the major spiritual traditions of the world. The Confucian calling, in other words, to become a person, in this case, a calling, presupposes that heaven is always present and heaven always knows, even though heaven does not have the power to do everything. That's the reason there's a strong belief that the human can enlarge the way cannot enlarge human. And it's also the reason that human beings are considered co-creators. But there's always an internal organic connectedness with heaven through our own personal experience, and that makes us aware both of our inadequacy as well as strength. Because in this sense, we are charged with the awesome responsibility of not only realizing ourselves, help others to realize themselves, but also realizing heaven and earth. The idea of forming a trinity with heaven and earth. You can say heaven is the source of creativity, the source of inspiration, and earth symbolizes nature. And many scholars in China, in the People's Republic of China, in the last 40 years, conflate the idea of nature with heaven. And they say, well, Confucianism is not a religious tradition. Heaven is always understood just as the natural process. But I think it's important for us to bear in mind, especially in the Neo-Confucian tradition, but in classical Confucian as well, to give a particular status to heaven which is not reducible to simply the natural process. Because there is certain kind of profound meaning for the person that cannot be easily understood in terms of the natural process. But the assumption is that it is humanly possible to assist in the transforming and nourishing processes of heaven and earth, humanly possible. It is authentically human to form a trinity with heaven and earth, and it is our moral responsibility to respond to heaven's calling. And heaven, in this sense, is always on the side of creativity, on the side of vitality, on the side of the harmonization of the world. It's never on the side of destruction. So in other words, in the Confucian mind, heaven as a symbol, as a center or source of creativity, is not only relevant to us in the naturalistic sense, but relevant to us in a profoundly religious sense. So I think it's important for us to understand the religious dimension in the Confucian tradition, even though it is not a religion, certainly not an organized religion. So I would argue for Confucians to fully realize themselves, it is not enough to become a responsible person in one's family, to become an effective worker in society, or to even become a conscientious political leader. No matter how successful one is in the social-political arena, the full measure of one's humanity cannot be accommodated without reference to heaven. That's the reason when they try to discuss about great ultimate, about heaven, about our natures being confirmed by heaven, about we can understand heaven through understanding our nature, through the realization of our heart and mind, about that all things are there in me. They're not simply making naturalistic statements. They're making profoundly significant ethical religious statements. The highest Confucian idea, we've returned to that time and time again, we need to remember that and remind ourselves, is the unity of the human and heaven, which defines humanity not only in anthropological terms, but also in cosmological terms. So the most authentic human being is always characterized by the person's ability to become sensitive and responsive, not only to the human world, but to nature and to the world beyond. So to be religiously musical is very important for the Confucians. Max Weber, a great modern thinker, said, well, for our modern professionals like himself, after the disenchantment of the magic garden, we become religiously unmusical. And they're very proud of the fact, in the modern times, a technocrat, economist, and so forth, we're not religiously musical because these are private matters, private feelings. We are dealing with the public sphere. This is a form of, I would call it anthropocentrism, in the sense it's focused on the human as the ultimate judgment for not only what is wrong and what is allowable, what is not allowable. Now, if man is the measure of all things, then anything we do to other forms of life, to nature, to anything beyond is justified. And we're being very proud that we can do it. And now we know the consequences are very grave. We don't have to get into the whole question of biodiversity, ecological issues, just the question about what kind of human beings are we if we can only link to the human world here and now as being meaningful. Unfortunately, this has been characterized as the Confucian project. No afterlife, no spiritual sanctuary outside of the world, and it is simply a form of social ethics, try to harmonize human relationships. Of course, heaven does not speak in the Confucian sense. And the way in itself cannot make human beings great, which suggested that although heaven is everywhere, is probably even omniscient, I mean, heaven knows. There's a very interesting anecdote in the Neo-Confucian, in the Confucian context. You know, most of the Confucians were actually bureaucrats, scholar officials. And one scholar official encountered a situation where someone wanted to bribe him in the night. So the two of them were there. The person said, take this bribe, only you and, just between you and me. Now this is a Confucian response. How can you say between you and me? Heaven knows, earth knows, and you know and I know before. In other words, there's some kind of internal resonances in the world. Anything we do in the privacy of our home in terms of the two persons is, in a very realistic sense, a public event. So our quality, in a sense, our quality to transcend the various kinds of constraints that shaped us into a particular kind of human being turned out to be morally extremely significant. We've talked about this time and time again. All these constraints, egoism, nepotism, parochialism, ethnocentrism or chauvinistic nationalism, even anthropocentrism, they have to be overcome simply to realize ourselves. And I think, let me introduce two words. I use them in a different context and may be helpful. One is subjectivism. The other one is subjectivity. Two loaded words, right? Subjectivism meaning an extremely confined parochial view based upon our own biases, our own limitations. So if you want to be a good scientist, the first thing you have to overcome is your subjective point of view. If you want to study anything, you have to be able to overcome your subjectivism. But subjectivity is a substance. It's something that you can call your own. Now, we make a distinction between the false self, the self that is not the real, and the real self. You may want to imagine that all forms of false self are reducible to subjectivism. And the true self is subjectivity, is your subjectivity, your inner self. The realization of your subjectivity, so we can use another term, say, deepened subjectivity. In other words, subjectivity can be deepened. Or you can even say deepening subjectivity. Deepening, continuous, deepening subjectivity, as opposed to any forms of subjectivism, okay? So egoism is a form of subjectivism we have to overcome. But by overcoming egoism, we're in touch with our true self. Our emotions are part of ourselves, to be sure. But some of the feelings of our emotions, such as commiseration, define more truthfully what our true self, what our subjectivity really is. And so it's not a subjective point of view. Now, if you follow this, then you can make a distinction between something which is profoundly personal, is not at all private. Something is profoundly personal can be publicly accounted. It's also publicly accountable. It's not just our private thoughts, private feelings. Now, the Neo-Confucians are not particularly interested in the private thoughts, private ideas, but they are very much interested in something that touched us very deeply in terms of our personal experience or personal ideas. It is in this sense we call Confucian humanism as inclusive. It is predicated on not just an anthropological vision, but also a cosmological vision. Humanity, in its all-embracing fullness, in its most extensive expression, forms unity with heaven and earth and myriad things. So self-realization, in the last analysis, is ultimate self-transformation. The process, that particular process, which enables us to embody, in terms of our sensitivity and sensibility, family, community, nation, and world, and the cosmos. Now, you can say the deepened subjectivity or deepening subjectivity always has an external referent. The more you deepen, the more you realize or understand your own subjectivity, the more you are psychologically, conceptually, emotionally ready to communicate. So subjectivism is always a blockage. We cannot communicate with the outside world because we're obsessed with our own self. But subjectivity, your true subjectivity, is a vehicle through which you'll be able to communicate with the outside world. And of course, that is your heart and mind. That's your heart and mind, but not the heart and mind that are overpowered or controlled by various kinds of selfish desires. Now, it is in this sense that Mencius has this description of a person, of a human being, a great person. The Neo-Confucians all take that extremely seriously. A great person is someone who lives in the spacious dwelling, occupies the proper position, and goes along the highway of the world. When the person achieves his ambition, he shares this with the people. When he fails to do so, he practices the way alone. He cannot be led into excesses when wealthy and honored, or deflected from his purpose when poor and obscure. Nor can he be made to bow before superior force. This is what I would call a great person, a great man. Now, what he has in mind is that each one of us, what is this spacious dwelling? The spacious dwelling refers to humanity. Humanity, not just imagined, humanity as practiced is man's peaceful abode. It's the dwelling. We live in humanity. And the proper path is the path of rightness, sometimes rendered as righteousness. The ability to, of course, the highway refers to the symbolic resources. The highway is the way of learning to be human. The idea is that the Confucian ought to be the guardian or the knight of the way of the human. So you identify yourself with the human project, and the human project is anthropocosmic. It's not just anthropological. So in that sense, you actually find the whole space of your dwelling as the universe. You find a niche in the universe. When you find a niche in the universe, in other words, the whole notion about the cosmic identification is to try to help us to find a general orientation. The general orientation is to be human in the ultimate sense is to become a co-creator. So you cannot be simply, your role of being a human cannot be simply reduced to social political categories of wealth and power. There's certain kind of meaning of being human that cannot be understood in terms of the rules of the game in the world here and now. So you have always the possibility of an access to something greater. That gives you inspiration, gives you a general orientation. And your way then is rooted in this cosmological vision. You can develop certain kind of judgment about what is allowable, what is not allowable, what is truly meaningful, what is not truly meaningful, because the subjectivity, your own subjectivity, can overcome all forms of subjectivism. In other words, to be self-reliant in this connection is not simply to allow oneself to be enclosed in a very small universe. You have the whole universe as your dwelling place. You can tap the resources from them. So to give you a general direction. You can say then there's a faith in the Confucian tradition, there's a faith in the power of heaven, in the power of heaven in the power of heaven to allow our ordinary existence to assume ultimate meaning. And this faith in humanity is faith in the creativity, especially the moral creativity of heaven itself. But to begin this practice, we have to first recognize that a human is situated in a particular context. A human is a concrete human being rather than simply an abstract entity of some kind. As a concrete human being, we need to cultivate that humanity not in the abstract, but in actual praxis. In this actual praxis, we have to ask ourselves how much of the inner resources we have already generated. And that sense of generating inner resources is based upon that every human being is deficient. We are connected with the universe, to be sure, in terms of our original nature, but in actual practice, in our daily life, we are very deficient. So there's always this gap between existentially what we are and ontologically what we are. Ontologically meaning in the reality of things. We are connected with the universe. But in the actual experience as an existential human being, we are very much constrained. So in this sense, the Confucians refuse, unlike many other religious traditions, refuse to accept universal love as the way to go. You have to recognize where you stand at a given juncture and how you will be able to relate meaningfully to the outside world based upon your own understanding of the resources you've already generated internally. If you don't feel strongly about a stranger, if you feel more closely linked to your family members, if you don't feel strongly about a distant star, that's okay. That is the natural order of things. But you have to recognize your inability to become meaningfully related to a stranger or your inability to link yourself to a distant star is an imposition, existential imposition. It is not the original nature of your human sensitivity. The original nature of the human sensitivity is capable of all this connectedness. And in our actual experience, it has been compromised because of all forms of subjectivism. And therefore, the cultivation has to begin with things at hand. So you have two very interesting visions. One, you can say, very, very idealistic about the interconnectedness of the world, about the human capacity to understand the world. And then they are very realistic injunction or understanding that the process is a ceaseless one. In other words, the process never ends. And therefore, you have to go through the actual practical living. Now, the idealism that I talked about is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we fail to understand what the Confucian personality is all about. For example, Max Weber, we mentioned about him before, describes Confucian personality as follows. This is his This is his vision of what a Confucian personality really is. A Confucian personality is a well-adjusted person. In other words, a person who is situated in the world, there's no spiritual sanctuary outside, very much adjusted to the status quo of the time. So this is Max Weber's understanding. A well-adjusted man rationalizing his conduct only to the degree requisite for adjustment does not constitute a systematic unit, but rather a complex of useful and practical traits. Such a way of life could not allow man an inward aspiration toward a unified personality, a striving which we associate with the idea of personality. Life remained a series of occurrences. Now, what he was trying to do is to contrast the Confucian personality with the Protestant Christian personality. He would say the Protestant Christian personality, inspired by the voice of God or by the idea of God, forms a coherent personality. There's a true personality there. Whereas the Confucian is someone who tries to adjust himself to the social roles. Trying to adjust himself to the social roles, he becomes harmonized with the world. He will be able to maybe assume some of these social roles very, very well. But from Max Weber's point of view, the Christian point of view, a very well-adjusted person may not have the inner spiritual center for true human self-transformation. So the person doesn't even have what we normally would call a personality. The person is just very well liked, very well situated in the social network. Curiously, this kind of person, what Confucius called a goody-goody villager, the person who is very pleasing to others, very much liked, and everybody considers that his companionship is very delightful, useful. What Confucius characterized this kind of person is a thief of virtue. It's not truly virtuous. It's not truly moral. The person is able to maybe acquire all the social skills to deal very well with the environment, with other people, very, very much situated. But this kind of person does not have a true personality. Not inspired by some high ideal, can never involve oneself in ultimate self-transformation. It's very serious. It's very serious critique. So the Confucian is not what Weber calls an adjusted person. Not an adjusted person at all. Not to submit oneself to the dictates of rituals, to the dictates of all these external conditions, so one becomes very well situated and adjusted. In fact, the Confucians argue forcefully against that kind of personality, because there's something much more profoundly meaningful, much more significant in the long run. Now, Mencius made a very interesting observation, again, keeping in mind subjectivity is not a form of subjectivism. Right? The profound person steeps himself in the way because he wishes to get it himself. When he gets it himself, he will be at ease with it. When he's at ease with it, he can trust it deeply. And when he can trust it deeply, he can find his source wherever he turns. This is why the profound person wishes to get it himself. This notion about get it himself or get it yourself is to allow the way. This way, of course, is a cosmological, anthropological way, the heaven, to be embodied in your own subjectivity, to be informed by heaven. Now, our own nature is actually confirmed by heaven. So it is our own property, it's our own right. And yet that is only a spark of inspiration. This is only a sprout, only an authentic possibility. It's not realized. To realize it, we have to go through the practical process of internalization. So to allow heaven, to allow the most generalizable ideal to be internalized in a way to inform who we are, it is in this sense the profound person steeps himself in the way and allowing the way eventually to reveal itself through the person. So to realize humanity as the ultimate value of human existence requires a spiritual transformation, requires the cultivation of a personality. And how we become a mature person with a personality, is how we become more than simply good. We become true, become beautiful, become great. You know, that process of becoming is the process of informing our subjectivity with ultimate reality. So this faith in the perfectibility or the transformability of human nature through self-effort is basically an answer to the dehumanizing tendencies of the historical moment in which we find ourselves. Therefore, you can say that the Confucians have, if they have faith, what is the faith? The faith in the transformative power of humanity. This is the Confucian faith. And they even believe that humanity always overcomes inhumanity like water overcomes fire. And yet, of course, many people pointed out in the time of Mencius and in the time of the New Confucians, there's a great deal of inhumanity around us. Atrocity, violence, and so forth. The answer is this: you cannot put off the fire of a cartload of fuel with just 1 cup of water. The reason that 1 cup of water you have and try to put off the fire of inhumanity is because the quantity of inhumanity is so extensive and the quality of being human is so limited. So you cannot do that. And yet, it is the natural order of things that water always capable of putting on fire. So this is the belief that there's something in the nature of its existence that it would be able to do something, and yet existentially it is not, because the supply is limited, that it would not be able to perform its own function. Now, even then, the argument is to say there's no other choice but to enhance collectively and individually your own humanity. But that enhancement can never be completed simply by abstract thinking, setting up rules and regulations. It has to go through the concrete experience of extending the inner feelings of commiseration that you originally have. And of course, if you can encourage others to do so, the forces will be greatly enhanced. Now, you have the Confucian project as an interplay between the idealization of the human ability to transform the world, because human being is a co-creator of the universe. At the same time, a very realistic understanding, anything you do, even in the privacy of your home, is painfully difficult. You have a general orientation what is possible, you have a realistic understanding of what is painfully difficult. And you have to negotiate between the two. And I think one of the most, to me, succinct and very powerful statement about this, embodied humanity, is a statement by Weiming. And we didn't get a chance to really study him. And I will read that statement and give you a brief account of what he has in mind. How universal human connectedness, how the idea of forming one body with heaven and earth, and the idea of differentiated love and anything you do here and now may not be able to transform the world. Why these two positions can coexist in this particular style of moral reasoning. It's not a contradiction, but it's a kind of creative tension. It's one paragraph, it's a little bit long. The great man regards heaven and earth and the myriad things as one body. He regards the world as one family and the country as one person. As to those who make a cleavage between objects and distinguish the self and others, they are small men. So let's say we are all small men in that sense. That the great man regards heaven, earth, and myriad things as one body is not because he deliberately wants to do so, but because it is natural to the human nature of his heart and mind that he do so. Forming one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things is not only true with the great man, even the mind and heart of the small man, people like us, is no different. Only he himself makes it small. Now, his demonstration, right? Therefore, when he sees a child about to fall into the well, he cannot help a feeling of alarm and commiseration. This shows that his humanity forms one body with the child. It may be objected that a child belongs to the same species. Again, when he observes the pitiful cries and frightened appearance of the birds and animals about to be slaughtered, he cannot help feeling an inability to bear their suffering. This shows that his humanity forms one body with birds and animals. It may be objected that birds and animals are sentient beings as he is, but when he sees plants broken and destroyed, he cannot help a feeling of pity. This shows that his humanity forms one body with plants. It may be said that plants are living things as he is. Yet even when he sees tires and stones shattered and crushed, he cannot help a feeling of regret. This shows that he forms one body with tires and stones. This means even the mind of the small man necessarily has the humanity that forms one body with all. Now, the idea of one body with all and the idea of differentiated love are integrated in this statement. To see a child fall into the well, the sense of commiseration, the sense of alarm, is different from when you see animals being slaughtered. And that may be different from when you see plants destroyed or stones crushed. So there's a degree of intimacy or degree of difference about your feelings. And yet, your ability to become stimulated, to become challenged by everything indicates the original capacity of the heart and mind. If you don't simply look at this in terms of a kind of cosmological vision, if you just confine it to the human community, the argument, again, is that your ability to link meaningfully to the people who are close to you, to your neighborhood, to your own community, to your own ethnic group, to your own society, your own country, differentiates quite clearly from your ability to link meaningfully to others. And that is not only allowed, that is understood as natural. However, if these natural feelings are not being extended and allow them simply to dictate the original quality of your heart and mind, you eventually not be able to function well as a living human being in connection with the outside world. So what we have here then is, on the one hand, a general direction, a general awareness of what the capacity of our heart and mind is and can become. At the same time, a realistic understanding, if we want to do it, what we ought to do by reflecting on things near at hand. So the two seemingly contradictory claims, ideally we're linked with the whole universe, and practically we have to do it here and now, are not only not contradictory. From the Neo-Confucian point of view, they have to come into a dialectic relationship, into a kind of interchange continuously. It is in this sense that it is profoundly religious, and yet it takes the world here and now, even our ordinary life, more important than the life after, the life yet to come, and the world here and now much more intimately important to our well-being than simply the universe outside. So you can have these two positions integrated in this particular fashion.